Tim, thank you so much for that introduction. Tim and Jane and all the folks at City Club, thank you for the work that you've put into organizing this Zoom session so that City Club members can join us. I also just want to say how much I appreciate the opportunity to be with you this afternoon. This continues a long, more than 20-year relationship that I've had with City Club, and I always appreciate the opportunity to be in front of you to share with you thoughts and ideas, because I know how much you as an organization value the opportunity to have serious thought and discussion around the ideas and issues that affect us today. I just want to take a moment now to bring up my presentation. I want to talk with you today about technology and social justice, and it would be almost impossible to do that without also talking about the times that we live in during a pandemic. And so I thought that we might profitably use this afternoon first to talk just a little bit about the history of technology and social justice. And then to talk about social justice in the time of a pandemic. And all of this is really leading to a breakout session that we've organized on Zoom that would allow each of you to engage with someone else in conversation about what will you do given some of the issues that we talk about today. If we have time at the end of that breakout session, we'll also have an opportunity for a question and answer session. You know, the idea that technology is not neutral is an idea that was really first put forward by the German philosopher Martin Heidegger in the post-World War II era. Essentially, Heidegger said, all technology is exploitative of either human or natural resources. Well, that's really interesting, you know, because here's Heidegger really writing and thinking about these things before there were ever cell phones or portable computers, and yet he was saying that all technology, like the technology we carry in our pockets or our purses, is in some way based on exploiting human or natural resources. Well, let's think about that. You know, you take out your cell phone and you say, well, geez, how is that exploitive of human or natural resources? And yet, the chips and the connectors and the circuit boards and the glass and the casing that goes to make the device that you're using so often during the day, all of those elements were once minerals that were in the ground. And in order to create these marvelous devices, we had to extract them or exploit the earth in order to fashion and make the technology that we use. And that, Heidegger would say, even though he wasn't alive during the time of this technology, is one of the ways that technology exploits natural resources. And if you take it one step further and you think about even the people who put together the circuit boards and the chips and the various devices that go to make up this marvelous technology that we again carry around in our pockets or our purses. Often those people are working in conditions which are substandard, if not subhuman. Technology exploits human and natural resources, and I would add to that, for the benefit of some, to the detriment of others. And so once we're even finished using these marvelous devices, what do? We take our technology and we ship it or send it or bring it to recycling places, and many people don't know that the end of the line for our technology is often in third world countries, piled high with the detritus of modern civilization and the technology that we use. Technology exploits both human and natural resources. Well, in writing my book and working on my book, Think Black, and it's a memoir about my father and his relationship with IBM, but more generally, it's a book about technology and human justice, social justice. I realized that if you look at the relationship between technology and communities of color, historically, what Heidegger is saying is really true. We look at, for example, the relationship between technology and African Americans. Here's a picture of a ship. It's actually called a caravel or a carrack. That's the technical name for that ship. And this is the kind of ship that Columbus sailed. It's the kind of ship that the explorers of that age sailed. Before this kind of ship was designed and built, ships were flat bottom, and they didn't have the bulge you see in the hull of this ship, because most of those ships, and now we're talking about early 1400s and before that, those ships were used for trade on the Mediterranean. And the Mediterranean, while it can certainly be rough, is nowhere near as rough as the Atlantic. And the problem was, when you took a ship like that out into the Atlantic, the conditions were not favorable. So if you took one of those earlier designed ships, and let's say you're the Portuguese, and you realize, oh my God, we really can exploit the natural and human resources along the coast of West Africa. But first we got to get there, and then we have to bring our cargo back. And if you were sailing one of those older design ships, the problem was the trade winds could get you very easily around Cape Verde, which is the west coast, the westernmost tip of Africa. And you could even get to the various ports along the west coast of Africa, let's say Angola. And there you might find various minerals, and you might also realize, well, you know, we can also buy, barter, or capture Africans as slaves, load them up in our ship, and bring them back to Europe or other places where we might sell both those minerals and the people. The problem was that when you tried to sail back, you were sailing against the prevailing trade winds. And those of you who are sailors know that the only way to do that is you have to tack to a point where you've got enough wind behind you that will get into your sails and bring you back home. Well, those old sailing ships sailed like, as we say, is on the sea, they sailed like pigs into the wind, meaning that they didn't do too well. And the tack that had to be taken was a tack that almost brought those ships to the coast of South America and Brazil in order to catch prevailing trade winds that might bring them back to Europe, which was both for the ships unsafe and risked the loss of both cargo and crew. So what did early Europeans do? Well, Europeans in the 15th century then redesigned the ships. That's the technology we're talking about here. So that the ships were deeper draft, larger space for the cargo, and had an array of sails similar to what you see here that allowed them to sail, again, as we say, in the nautical realm, the term is closer to the wind. which means they didn't have to tack as far out as Brazil in order to get safely back to Europe. So what we have then is a technology designed specifically to exploit human and natural resources. Of course, the natural resources that were being exploited were gold in particular. That's why parts of Africa were called the Gold Coast. And the human resources that were being exploited were slaves. Technology is not neutral. Technology exploits either human or natural resources or both to the benefit of some and to the detriment of others. Another really great example of that, again, in terms of African American history, is this device. So this is from the patent drawings for the cotton gin. Prior to Elias Whitney's cotton gin, it might take one person, usually that person was an enslaved African American, a full day just to produce 1 pound of cotton. And of course, the problem there was to separate seeds from the cotton lint, the fluffy stuff. Well, Whitney invented, we didn't really invent, to be honest. A lot of people had this idea. He kind of put together the best of breed, we might say, the best technology into a machine that you could crank by hand, you could drive by water, you could even drive by horses. There are lots of ways to actually drive these large cotton gins. And you could do in one day as much as 50 enslaved people could do. And so a lot of people thought, this is great. This technology is actually going to help to bring an end to slavery. Well, some people even said that that was why, or one of the reasons that Whitney designed it. That's not really true. At least I've never been able to find any substantive information or source material that Whitney himself actually thought that his machine was going to help end slavery. Whitney was in it for the money. But a lot of people thought this is great. Slavery is not going to survive because there's just not going to be the economic incentive if a machine can do 50 times more than a man can do. Well, the bizarre thing is that instead of this technology actually bringing about an end to slavery, slave owners realized very quickly, oh my God, if I can feed these machines more cotton, I can make more cotton bales. I can sell more of those bales to New England mills and to mills in Britain. I can make more money. But in order to do that, I need more slaves. And so a technology that started out as potentially, some people thought, reducing slavery, actually gave rise to more slavery. In 1790, just before cotton gin was really introduced, there were approximately 700,000 slaves in the United States. In 1860, there were somewhere between 4 and 5 million. And that increase, in many ways, very much related to the technology, in this case, the cotton gin. But there are other examples of that, which I'm not going to go deeply into. The railroads, constructions of canals, a lot of the early technology there, even the telegraph, thought at first that these devices were going to help to reduce slavery, end up actually increasing slavery. Now, probably say just a moment here what I mean when I say the telegraph. And that's a really good example where what happened is now you've got a means to communicate between buyers and sellers that actually make the transactions around slavery that much quicker. And that therefore enhances rather than detracts the need or the desire that many Southern plantation owners had for more slaves. The point in all this, again, is to say that technology has a deep connection with human justice, and often it doesn't have that connection on the right side of the equation of human justice and technology. So now let's move into the late 1900s and see, excuse me. So now let's move into the late 19th century. And what we're really looking at then is a technology that looks like this. I might ask you, what are we looking at here? And I would be surprised if anybody who's watching this presentation could tell me, but I'll tell you, we're looking at the first ever punch card device. This was called a Hollerith machine after Hermann Hollerith, the German engineer who created it. And here is the first ever punch card punching machine. And these early machines were actually used for the United States Census. For a census, really in the late 1800s, there was a concern that there were so many people to count that if you did the census by hand, by the time you finished 1 year census, by the time you finished 1 year census, you would be into the need for the new census, even though it was almost 10 years away. That's how many people in order to count and tabulate. So the Census Bureau then set up a competition. Who has the best technology that would allow us to automate the census count? And Hermann Hollerith, the German engineer who lived in the United States, actually won that competition, and his technology, the punch card, then became the basis for the census count. The punch card also became the basis for digital technology. Hollerith's company was gobbled up eventually by a company that we know as IBM. And in the 1920s then, you saw IBM with this new technology in the 20s and 30s first get involved in eugenics, and from that use this new technology of punch cards in Nazi Germany as well too. And you might say, well, I don't understand. What's the connection there? It's simple. Eugenics was based on the whole idea that you could separate out the people you wanted and the people you didn't. And that means you could count those that were in and count those that were out. And who was in for eugenics was this kind of notion of Nordic stock, blonde-haired, blue-eyed individuals, and who was out was anybody who didn't fit that: African Americans, Native Americans, people of color, communities of color, anyone who was of a different sexual orientation, and the list goes on. But the important thing is you have to be able to count. The technology of counting is the technology behind the census. IBM got involved with that. IBM then took that technology to Nazi Germany. But the same thing was true. You need to count. You want to count now who's a Jew and who's not a Jew. And it was punch card technology which was the basis for that counting. Punch cards were used to identify Jews. They were used to schedule train runs that would bring Jews to concentration camps. The punch cards even had in them, and these are IBM punch cards, IBM technology, the punch cards had columns which would determine how each person in that concentration camp would die. Would they be sent to a gas chamber? Would they be sent to an oven? Would they be worked to death? It's horrible to think, but this was the technology that was there. And I want to say, again, this is the technology that's actually behind the computer technology that we use today, that we're coming to you with the Zoom presentation today. It's really got its start on the wrong side of human justice. But IBM didn't stop there. After the war, after the Second World War, IBM took that same technology to South Africa, where they then used punch card technology in order to support every aspect of apartheid. And if you think about it, it's, again, a similar thing. You want to count who's in and who's not, who's black, who's colored, who's white. And that's a technology that punch cards were able to help with. And by the time of the 1950s and 60s and 70s and 80s, when IBM was so deeply involved with this process, it wasn't only punch cards then. It was more sophisticated computers and databases. IBM actually created the pass systems that were in use in South Africa, the pass cards. You had one set of pass cards called the Pass of Life, the Pass Book of Life, that were used for white and colored population. You had another set of identification cards called the Dom Pass. It was the Afrikaans for dumb pass, as the black South Africans would call it, and that was used for black population in South Africa. IBM created not only the data behind that, but actually the printing equipment that printed those passbooks. Again, counting who's in, who's not. Well, it keeps going. IBM, for example, after 9/11, particularly very deeply involved in all that went on in those days with facial recognition technology. Idea is the same thing. You want to count. You got thousands of people potentially coming into your city or moving in a protest, and you want to count who's there and who's not. And in 2005, for example, using data unknowns to New Yorkers from video footage, CCTV footage collected by the New York City Police, IBM then really trained or attempted to train that technology to be able to discriminate based on skin color. Again, this is technology that's on the wrong side of human justice. And we know, for example, that technology is not very good, for example, at discriminating based on skin color, even based on sex. Recent report by the National Institute of Standards and Technology at the end of last year studied 100 different kinds of facial recognition technologies, those produced by Microsoft, and Amazon, and others. And what they showed is that that technology was especially poor at recognizing African Americans, Native Americans, women, the very young or the very old. Who did it work for? The people that designed it. For white men between 25 and 40, it was pretty good. Recognizing that, and I would really want to say a lot of us actually then lobbied and worked and wrote and did things to say to some of these technology companies, you can't use this technology because it's on the wrong side of social justice. And we were very pleased. I have to say I was very pleased that not long ago, several weeks ago, IBM first came out with a statement: we're no longer going to pursue this kind of work in facial recognition technology. Followed very quickly on the heels of that announcement, Amazon and Microsoft said the same thing. We're no longer going to pursue this. At least we're going to lobby for the need for some kind of regulation, for some kind of standards in this field, so that if facial recognition technology is used, we know that the technology is not going to be discriminatory. Are there potentially good uses for facial recognition technology? I think there may be. Part of facial recognition technology is the capability of identifying people who have an elevated temperature when you connect infrared sensing to facial recognition technology. And that might be useful. I say might. That might be useful in the days of now we are in a pandemic, and being able to identify and help people understand that they might be at risk and that they need to be examined a little further. So while the big companies got out of the field, that didn't stop facial recognition technology. It hasn't. There are many companies who have stepped into that void and continue on with this kind of technology, which is on the wrong side of social justice, even though there might be some good uses for that technology today. So that's just a really brief history of the relationship between technology and social justice. And now what I'd like to do is to look at social justice and the pandemic and try in some ways to connect both these two. So I've been really talking about this as a eugenic pandemic. And why do I say eugenic pandemic is because in many respects, the pandemic or the microbe is doing what eugenics movement itself couldn't do. It seems to be targeting, although I don't believe in any respect that that microbe has behind it any intent to discriminate, but the people who seem to be targeted or hit most by this pandemic are communities of color. And there are really good reasons for that. And I thought we just might want to look at what is behind some of those reasons. You know, we can say that it's inequality in the healthcare system, maybe even inequality in the housing system, where now people are living in communities which don't even allow some of the benefits of being able to socially distance and to be able to work at home. In order to understand that history, I think we have to go back in time a little bit and look at how inequity has developed in this country. So I think it was probably, it was 2018 when a committee which had started in 1968 as the Kerner Commission released their 50-year report. This was a foundation called the Eisenhower Foundation, who had a committee which had been following, following the results of the Kerner Commission for the last 50 years. What's the Kerner Commission? For those of you who don't know, the Kerner Commission was impaneled by Lyndon Baines Johnson in 1967 because the cities were up in arms and there were rebellions then, as we see now, in terms of police brutality, in terms of social justice, and in terms of reducing inequities. So Johnson impaneled the Kerner Commission, and every 10 years, that commission produced a report based on statistics that they had collected. And the idea with the 50th anniversary report was to look back over those 50 years to see what progress had been made in reducing inequities in the United States based on race. Let's look at some of the results of those studies. I simply kind of extracted them and put them into a form that we might see. So if we're looking at the median income of United States households by race, the top line, the purple line, is for Caucasians, the blue line for blacks, African Americans. You can see that the discrepancy that we saw in 68, or at least in this chart, I think it goes back to 98, that discrepancy is still with us today. If we look at the net worth of households by race, you see a similar discrepancy. And again, the Kerner Commission was trying to understand, was there inequity in the United States, and also get a sense of why. If you look at unemployment by race, again, the blue line, African Americans, purple line, Caucasian Americans, you can see a discrepancy there as well too. Left side of the graph is what, maybe 68 or whenever, 98 in this case. It looks like it's all the way back to 68. Right side is modern day, 2018. Let's look at home ownership by race. So when I hear people talk about all of these things happened in the 1960s, Voting Rights Act was passed and Civil Rights Acts were passed, and things are not the same. I also look at these statistics and see how, yeah, they're not the same. They're actually, in some cases, worse. So this is one that really gets to me. The Kerner Commission studied segregation, and this is particularly segregation in schools over this 50-year period. The higher on that graph, the less segregation. The lower on that graph, the more segregation. So look at how precipitously that graph has dropped, which means there's greater segregation in our society today than there was 50 years ago. It's hard to believe, but again, this is the hard data that has been collected by the Kerner Commission. Incarceration rates by race. Number of police killings of unarmed victims by race. And again, this is just 2015. This data wasn't collected by the Kerner Commission. I actually got this from the Guardian newspaper, an article in the Guardian. Again, you see really large discrepancies. And if we're going to look in healthcare and other aspects of social life, public policy, we again see this really large discrepancy. And so, for example, in the upper left-hand corner, upper left-hand quadrant of this square, it's a question of communities of color living near environmental hazards. You see the large discrepancy there. Upper right-hand corner, the number of grocery stores that are within communities of color versus white communities. Grocery stores, obviously, it's where you get your food. That's where you're able to construct or develop a healthy lifestyle. If the only store in an area that you live is a convenience store that sells junk food, well, that's going to be the kind of food that's going to be most accessible for you. And so as a friend of mine says, African Americans and communities of color are often located in not just food deserts, but it's as though there was a food apartheid. Lower left-hand corner, percentage of obesity, which really is directly related to some of these other factors as well. And finally, it's just looking at lower right-hand corner, some of the expenditures based on health. So these are the factors that go into the inequities that really give rise to what we see in the pandemic in terms of this unequal distribution of how the health of one community is affected more so than the health of other communities. And we all saw this really, really, really horrible image of Derek Chauvin kneeling on the neck of George Floyd. You know, it's really interesting, and I don't have this slide. I wish I did. When I first saw this slide, I said to myself, I have seen this before. And I don't just mean in the cases of other African American, mostly men like Eric Garner and others, whom have also suffered and been killed at the hands of police. There was something iconic in a strange and bizarre and sad way about this image. And then I remembered where I saw it. Again, I don't have that image now, but it's an image that was related to the Old Testament. And there is in the Old Testament a phrase, and some of you may even know that phrase. I don't remember the numbers for it as quickly as I might. I actually think it comes from Joshua. It might actually be Joshua 22:23. So maybe I do remember the numbers there. And in the Old Testament, it talks about how one king asks other kings to put their feet on the necks of their enemies. And by doing that, they will be doing the work of God. And the image that's often used there, in fact, this image exists as a bas relief in, I think it's the British Museum, is of an Assyrian king stepping on the neck of someone whom he has subdued. And it really looks like that someone who he has subdued might in fact be an Egyptian. And I thought when I saw that image, oh my God, this is something that is really, really deep in Western culture. This idea that somehow someone is justified in taking the life of another, based in this case on religious affiliation or race. Of course, in this country, it's a very old and it's a deep story. I wish I had more time to even talk to you about the history here, but let's just go back to 1800s. I think this is 1858. On the left, you'll see a badge from North Carolina, I believe. It's a badge from the Slave Patrol. On the right, a badge from the modern day Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department. One of the things we know about police brutality, and that's really coming to light as we look at all that's going on now in terms of protests during this time of pandemic, and the desire that many people, particularly our young people, are telling us we need to seriously take this idea of reducing police violence to heart, even talking about defunding the police. Behind that is an incredibly long, sad history of policing in the United States being connected directly to slavery. And while we can trace it back to things like the runaway slave patrols, it even goes back further than that. But let's just go back as far as the runaway slave patrols and say that throughout the South, actually throughout the country, there was this idea that runaways could be pursued and taken back to their original owners. Now, when I say it was this idea, I don't just mean it was the idea of some rogue southern states. This idea is within and put there within the United States Constitution. One of the clauses, and again, I'm sorry, but I don't remember the actual number of that clause, but at the beginning of the Constitution, it's within the first one or three clauses, one to four clauses of the Constitution, is a clause that was called the Fugitive Slave Clause or the Fugitive Slave Act. And that was a capitulation by the North in 1787 in Philadelphia to the South to make sure the Constitution said if a slave runs away from a southern state and ends up in a northern state, that northern state has the obligation under law to return that slave to the southern state and owner from which he or she came. And along with that, then developed this whole system. It really was a system that started off private, of slave patrols, and as the number of slaves grew and as slavery extended out from plantations into urban areas then soon realized, well, maybe there's actually too many folks for us to try to control. And so instead of having this as just private, urban areas actually then began to merge so they could fund larger publicly funded groups, which wound up being the police forces that were organized based on controlling, patrolling, and apprehending African Americans, who might potentially run away, but actually the patrols were there to make sure they didn't run away. Wow. I mean, that's a really intense history, and as I said again, it's a history that goes really deeply in this country, right back to the founders, even before that to colonial times. And as we're talking about this, as we're talking about the history here, you know, a lot of times you'll hear people say, it happened long ago, why are we worrying about it now? Yes, there were slave patrols then, but, you know, it doesn't affect us now. I just want to take just a minute and show you, say to you, at least share with you my thoughts about why something like this does affect us now. And as an example, I want to go back to the Constitution. So yes, we said there was a Fugitive Slave Act's Fugitive Slave Clause in the Constitution. Some of you that are history buffs might know that not long after the Civil War, with the passage of the 13th Amendment, which outlawed slavery and gave a certain amount of civil rights, supposedly that Fugitive Slave Clause was rendered null and void. The fact is that that clause in the United States Constitution has never been repealed. And the Fugitive Slave Act was actually used as early, as late, or as recently as 1988 in a case, I believe it was in Utah. So this is one way in which the results of the past are with us in the present, but there's an even more graphic way to understand this or to see that. And again, I want to go back to 1787, Philadelphia, Second Constitutional Convention, really trying to put together now, after the Revolutionary War, after the Articles of Confederation were shown to be inadequate to really define who we were, who this was as a new country. And so the creation of a new constitution then came about. As part of the discussions around the Fugitive Slave Clause, or really leading up to the Fugitive Slave Clause, part of the discussions were about representation. And as part of those discussions on representation, there was a concern about who would be counted and who would not. Really kind of interesting that, again, see this tie-in, and that's really what I hope in some way to be demonstrating here, this tie-in between technology and even our earliest thoughts about social justice. And by that, what I mean is the North was concerned that if you counted all of the people in the South would have too much power because you would have to count the slaves. Even though the slaves didn't have the right to vote, there was that concern of, oh my God, there's enough bodies there that that'll give the South more power than the North. So here are the founders, and they're trying to determine the basis of representation for the House of Representatives. And two ideas are put forward. One is called, quote, quotas of contribution. And the other is called, quote, numbers of free individuals. Now, on the surface, neither of those two says anything about slavery. And yet that's what it's all about. In fact, the Constitution itself, the basic Constitution, you won't even find the word slavery mentioned once. And yet 25% of the clauses in that Constitution are related to slavery and the North's really appeasement of the South. But we're back to the idea of quotas of contribution and numbers of freemen. So quotas of contribution is the polite way that the delegates in 1787 to that Constitutional Convention said, by quotas of contribution, we mean counting slaves as well as free white men. And free white, or the numbers of free men, and it used the word white, but that was what was implied. Now, the concern was if you adopt quotas of contribution, the South will have more people than the North, and that will give them a greater advantage. and the numbers of representatives. That'll give them more power. So the North was concerned about that, and the South wanted that, and so that tension led to a compromise. And the compromise was this: let's just count slaves as 3/5 of a person. And that will then, in some ways, balance out how much power the South has with how much power the North has. And that 3/5 clause is right there in the Constitution. And it's the basis for determining the House of Representatives, the number of representatives from each state. And you might then ask, well, why does that matter? I mean, you know, that happened in 1787. It doesn't affect us today. The 13th Amendment was passed. African Americans have the vote. Women have the vote. So those issues no longer matter. But what that kind of thinking doesn't bring to bear, or doesn't allow for, is an understanding that's just a little bit deeper. As the Constitutional Convention went on, there was also the question of how do you elect the president? Are we going to have everybody vote? Well, if we have everybody vote, we're kind of back to the whole idea of quotas of contribution, which means that the South will have more power in selecting a president than the North. And because of that, then, the idea that came up was, well, let's have an electoral college which is based on the number of representatives from each state, which is based on slaves being counted as 3/5 of a person, and that will then equilibrate or balance out who has the power. Now look, nothing has ever taken down the Electoral College. We are still under that kind of system. If we did not have the Electoral College, I can pretty much tell you that Al Gore would have been president. If we did not have the Electoral College, Donald Trump would not be president. Folks, we don't live in a popular democracy. We live in a representative democracy. And the representation of that representative democracy is based on slavery. I mean, you only have to go back to understanding the arguments around the Constitution and look at why we have Electoral College to realize that. I'm not just saying that. That's just the facts of how historically the Constitution came about. And so I'm saying that to say it does matter what happened back then. It matters now. I'll give you another example of why that matters now, or why understanding what happened then matters now. One of the things that's going on right now is our young people are calling for statutes with a T to come down. And I'm just going to say I'm certainly supportive of some of those statutes with a T coming down. I also think, as I just said, the statutes without the T need to come down as well too. I'd love to see the 3/5 clause, or actually the basis for the Electoral College in the 3/5 clause. I'd like to see the Electoral College removed. I'd love to live in a popular democracy where all of us, based on our preference, then voted for president, and our presidents were selected that way. Be that what it may, the other example that I wanted to discuss, or at least share with you, is around this whole business of statutes coming down. We also hear the call, for example, for the changes in the names of bases, in the Army. And I was listening the other day to General Milley, Joint Chiefs of Staff, head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, saying, well, he really felt that maybe the Army should seriously consider changing of base names, because, take a base name like Fort Bragg, named after General Braxton Bragg, a Confederate general. An African-American soldier walking onto that base might feel somewhat offended by the fact that he is, or she is, walking onto a base named after a slaveholder and someone who fought for the Confederacy. And General Milley rightly said, those men, those generals, took an oath to protect the Constitution, and they violated that oath, which actually then makes them traitors. Why do we have bases named after them? And again, I thought, wow, that's really good. I'm glad to hear that. I agree. Base probably should have its name changed. But what I didn't hear General Milley say was this. During the Civil War, in the state of Louisiana, which at that time was under the control of the Union and particularly under the control of General Benjamin Franklin Butler, Union soldiers protected the home of General Braxton Bragg because his family was concerned that their slaves would revolt and demand their freedom. At the same time that General Braxton Bragg was in Kentucky killing Union soldiers. Let me just say that again, because that's pretty bizarre and convoluted. The forces of the Union North, Union soldiers, were protecting a general's home in the South from slaves who wanted their freedom. So that Southern general of the Confederate Army could be in Kentucky killing Union soldiers. How bizarre is that? And I thought, not only does the base name need to be changed, General Milley, but someone needs to apologize for incidents like that. So it's important we understand something about the past, which brings us to this present moment where our young people are in the streets. And I applaud them because I think it's really, really, really important. Everything that they're agitating for and advocating for, which brings us to the question, what will you do? Now, there's a lot of talk these days about the idea of being an ally. And what does that mean to be an ally? One of the things I've been suggesting is that being an ally is not enough. You really need to talk about how are you going to be an accomplice for social justice and for social change. An ally is somebody who says, hey, I'm with you, I believe in what you're saying, I like what you're saying, but they don't necessarily risk anything in order to make a difference. An accomplice says, not only do I believe in what you're doing, but I'm going to get out there and be with you in the struggle. So here's what I really see as the difference then from ally to accomplice. An ally is somebody who wants to listen and learn. Hey, I really like to hear more about what it is your experience is and what's going on for you. That'll help me learn. But that's not enough today. If we're going to make a difference, we need to talk about the two other L's beyond listening and learning, and one is lending. And by lending, what I mean is lending privilege. I'll give you some great examples of lending privilege. How about the moms in Portland who stood in front of their young people, between the young people who were protesting and the troops or the police or the federal forces that were there? How about the dads who were there with leaf blowers to blow away the tear gas and the pepper spray that federal forces, local authorities, were shooting at their young people? How about the veterans who were there between the young people and these forces, who were there, all of them, the moms, the dads, the veterans, lending the privilege that they had in order to support the demands that the young folks behind them were making. That's what I mean by lending privilege. All of us have privilege in some way, shape, or form, whether it comes from our age, whether it comes from our skin color, whether it comes from our pocketbook, whether it comes from the positions we hold. We have privilege, and we can lend privilege in order to help those who don't have privilege but are advocating for change to make that change happen. And of course, not only is lending privilege important, but leading is important. And really the two almost go together, because the moms and the dads and the veterans not only said, I'm going to lend my privilege, but I'm going to take a stand and lead with that. And they went out to make a difference. So I think it's important to consider what that means for all of us as we move beyond just thinking about being an ally, but thinking to be an accomplice. And that then brings up what we're going to do now, which is to ask you to break into groups. And the folks behind this Zoom meeting at City Club who are arranging for all of this have actually determined how you will then break up into those groups, one screen talking to another screen, and a join button will come up, and when you click on that, you'll be brought into that session. But before you do, I'm going to suggest that the question you engage with each other on in these breakout sessions is the following. Given the current state of affairs in this country, what am I able and what am I willing to do? Now, when I was here at City Club about a year ago, I spoke about how you have an important conversation around a difficult subject. And this question, really speaking to what's going on right now, I can't think of a more important conversation or a more difficult subject. And I shared with you a year ago 3 tools for having a difficult discussion. And I hope some of you remember that, but I'm going to at least summarize those 3 tools right now before you have your discussions in these breakout sessions. So the first tool was to have some basic definitions. And a year ago, one of the definitions I presented to you was a definition around racism, that racism was prejudice plus power. Prejudice alone didn't rise to the level of racism, but when you added power to that, that became racism. So having basic definitions is a place to start. I also suggested that active listening was really important. In active listening, there were 3 parts to that. The first was listening without talking. So you're actually giving a person who's talking the time to speak without interjecting anything. The second part of that was being able to repeat back to that person, this is what I heard you say. Did I get it right? And the third part of that was simply allowing that person to be and say whatever that person felt was necessary. So listening without talking, repeating without editing, and simply holding that person in a space where you say it's okay for you to say or share whatever it is you want. And the third tool was speaking or engaging or listening and talking from your heart and not your head. When you speak, you're not just saying this is what I think, but you're coming from your heart and saying this is how I feel. And when you're listening, you're not listening based on what is that person causing me to think? What thoughts come up when I hear this person speaking? But you're saying, hey, I'm listening. Or you're feeling, I'm listening, and how does this make me feel? Make me feel angry or happy or sad or agitated? Doesn't matter. Given those 3 tools, I'm going to invite you to have a discussion around the question, given the current state of affairs in this country, what am I able and what am I willing to do? It'll be about 20 minutes, and I'm going to ask you to arrange that discussion in this way. For the first 10 minutes, one screen or one person will be the person or screen talking. And the other person or screen will be the screen listening. And I'll keep time. After 10 minutes, you're going to switch. Whoever was listening will be the ones speaking. Whoever was speaking will be the ones listening. And after 20 minutes, 10 minutes for each segment, we'll get back together and have time, I believe, for questions and answers. Thank you. Well, I want to thank you for spending the time to have a discussion about what will you do, and for about the questions that you brought up from that discussion. A lot of times people ask me about local resources that might help them, and I'm just going to suggest 3. There are many more. First resource I would like to suggest is our Whatcom Human Rights Task Force. I can't think of a better organization to support and to work with during this time. 2 books come to mind. One of the first books I would think of would be How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram Kendi. Came out in 2019, available through Village Books. Ibram has not only marvelous stories, but some very clear ideas about what we all can do to become less racist. I'm also going to suggest, if you're interested in some of the ideas that I spoke of today, you might consult my book, Think Black, which came out in 2019 as well, for more along the lines of what I spoke of. Having said that, let me say thank you very much for this opportunity to be with you at City Club today. Thank you for your interest in ideas like this, and thank you for your commitment to make Bellingham, Whatcom County, and the area that we live in a better place for us all.